She was 21 and newly married into a family that did not want her. She had no dowry to speak of, no title, no allies in the great cold house they had sent her to, only a small tin box of her grandmother's seeds and the plain gold ring on her finger. And when her in-laws handed her the key to the iron-framed greenhouse at the far end of the garden, the one no servant would enter, the one whose lock had not turned since her mother-in-law vanished inside it 11 years before, they meant it as a joke, or a punishment, or perhaps a quiet way of being rid of her. But what nobody in that house knew was that behind the rusted door, beneath the broken leaded glass and the ivy that had grown thick as rope across the panes, something was waiting that would unmake every story they had told about themselves. Settle in with a cup of tea and let us know in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, because this story is a long one, and it is worth every quiet minute of it. Sarah Weaver had been born in a small stone cottage on the edge of a Somerset village, the only daughter of a stonemason who died of lung fever when she was 9, and a mother who lasted 3 winters more before she too was buried in the churchyard behind the low gray wall. There had been no brothers to inherit the trade and no uncles to take her in, and so Sarah, at 12, had gone into service at the vicarage in the next parish, where the vicar's wife was kind in a distant way, and the cook, a widow named Mrs. Hollisher, took one look at the thin, watchful child and quietly decided that this one would be taught properly, or not at all. Mrs. Hollisher had been in service 43 years, had buried a husband and 2 grown sons, and had a manner so plain and unhurried that Sarah, who had learned young to make herself small, felt for the first time in her life that she was permitted to take up a full breath of air. It was Mrs. Hollisher who taught her to bake bread with a hand that could feel the dough alive under it, and to render lard, and to keep a still room, and to press herbs between muslin and salt, and to graft a cutting of rose onto a stronger stock, and to read a seed catalogue as though it were scripture. It was Mrs. Hollisher, too, who taught her that a woman with skill in her hands was never wholly at the mercy of anyone else's kindness, and that gardens were the one country in the world where patience was always eventually rewarded. Sarah stayed at the vicarage 7 years, and in that time she grew tall and steady-handed and quiet in her habits, and she took her half-days walking the hedgerows with a basket, learning the difference between comfrey and foxglove, between meadowsweet and hemlock, between the colt's foot that broke fever and the ragwort that killed cattle. She was 17 when Mrs. Hollisher fell ill of a slow wasting in the chest, and 18 when she nursed her through the last long winter, sitting up beside her in a small room above the scullery with a candle and a book of psalms and a bowl of thin barley broth kept warm on the hob. Before she died, Mrs. Hollisher gave Sarah 2 things: a battered copy of Loudon's Encyclopedia of Gardening with pressed leaves between half its pages, and a small brass trowel with a worn wooden handle, no bigger than a serving spoon, that had belonged to her mother before her and to her grandmother before that. The trowel had a nick in its blade, and the initials M.H. burned faintly into the handle, and Sarah wrapped it in a square of linen and carried it with her everywhere afterward, in the deep pocket of her apron or the bottom of her carpet bag, the way another woman might have carried a locket or a lock of hair. She was 19 when Thomas Weaver came to the vicarage on a matter of parish business, the youngest son of a family of some standing, sent down from his father's estate to consult with the vicar over a question of tenancy. And he had seen her in the kitchen garden bending over a row of late peas and had come back the next week and the week after, and by autumn he had asked her to marry him against every wish of his people. Thomas was gentle and slightly indecisive and terribly fond of her, and Sarah, who had not expected to be loved by anyone at all after Mrs. Hollisher, said yes with a full heart and a clear head, understanding perfectly well what she was walking into. They were married in the village church on a wet March morning, with only the vicar and the sexton for witnesses, and by April they were on the road north to Ashcombe Hall, where Thomas's father and mother and elder brother waited, having sent a single stiff letter saying that the young couple might come and take up the east rooms until some suitable arrangement could be made. Sarah understood the shape of what was coming before the coach had crossed the county line. She had, after all, been in service. She knew what it looked like when a household had already decided against a person. She packed her tin box of grandmother's seeds, poppy and marigold and sweet pea, and a paper twist of runner beans her mother had saved the summer before she died, and she packed Loudon's encyclopedia wrapped in oilcloth, and she packed Mrs. Hollisher's brass trowel in the pocket sewn inside her traveling cloak, where she could feel the weight of it against her hip whenever she moved. She packed 3 plain wool dresses, 2 aprons, a shawl her mother had knitted, her Bible, her needle case, and the pair of sturdy ankle boots she had bought with her last quarter's wages. That was the whole of what she brought with her into her marriage: a small trunk, a carpet-bag, a husband who loved her without quite knowing how to defend her, and the steady private conviction that a woman who could tell hemlock from parsley and coltsfoot from ragwort would find her feet in the end, wherever she was set down. She did not yet know the name of the greenhouse at Ashcombe Hall, or the story of the woman who had walked into it one September morning 11 years earlier and never walked out, but she was, without knowing it, exactly the sort of person the iron-framed house at the end of the garden had been waiting for. They arrived at Ashcombe Hall on the second afternoon of travel, when the rain had thinned into a fine gray drift, and the coach horses were dark with sweat along their flanks. The house sat back from the lane behind a low park of unclipped limes, a long gray block of local stone with a slate roof gone patchy at the eaves, and a row of tall sash windows staring out over a gravel sweep pocked with weeds. Thomas handed her down, and Sarah stood a moment with her carpet-bag at her feet, taking the measure of the place as she had once taken the measure of the vicarage kitchen on her first morning at 12 years old. The state of the paint on the front door, the crack running through the second step, the neglected boot-scraper choked with last year's leaves. A footman in an old plum-colored coat came for the trunk without meeting her eye, and a housekeeper in bombazine received them in the hall with a small, stiff nod for Thomas and a smaller, stiffer one for his wife. Thomas's father, Mr. Weaver the elder, was a tall, spare man in a black frock coat who put out one dry hand for Sarah to touch and then withdrew it as though the touching had cost him something. Thomas's mother had been dead these 11 years. The woman at the head of the drawing-room hearth was his father's second wife, called simply Mrs. Weaver, a pale, narrow person of 45, with a mouth like a folded handkerchief. Thomas's elder brother, Mr. Edmund, stood by the window with his hands behind his back and did not turn round at all when they were announced. Tea was brought in silence. Sarah was given a chair at some distance from the fire, and after 10 minutes of thin general remarks about the weather and the state of the North Road, the elder Mr. Weaver set down his cup, folded his napkin with great care into a small white square, and said, in the same even voice with which he might have discussed the price of hay, that as the east rooms had been found on inspection to be somewhat damp, he thought it best that Thomas and his wife should be put into the 2 small chambers over the old still room, and that as for a portion, for they must, he supposed, speak of a portion, he had considered the matter, and would settle upon Sarah in her own right the iron greenhouse at the end of the garden, together with such ground as lay within its walls. That, he said, was what he was able to do. That was what he would do. He said it without looking at her. Mrs. Weaver looked at her carefully, as one looks at a dish to see whether it has been properly wiped. Mr. Edmund at the window gave the smallest sound that might have been a laugh, cut off before it fully arrived. Thomas beside her drew a breath and half rose from his chair. Sarah put her hand very lightly on his sleeve, and he sat back down. She did not argue. She did not look at any of them. She thanked her father-in-law for the settlement in a voice as level as his own, thanked Mrs. Weaver for the tea, gathered her gloves from her lap, and asked quite plainly whether she might have the key. There was a small pause. The housekeeper was sent for. A great iron key was brought in on a wooden tray as though it were a specimen at an inquest, and laid before Sarah on the low table beside her chair. It was longer than her hand and rust-eaten at the bit, and there was a scrap of faded green ribbon tied through its bow. She took it up, felt the cold weight of it settle into her palm, slipped it into the pocket of her traveling cloak beside Mrs. Hollisher's trowel, and stood. The 2 small chambers over the still room were reached by a back stair that smelt of mice and old plaster, and their windows looked out not upon the park, but upon the kitchen yard, where a tabby cat sat washing itself between 2 upturned pails. There was a narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a deal chest of 3 drawers, and a single rush-bottomed chair. Sarah set her carpetbag on the chair, laid Loudon's encyclopedia on the chest of drawers, put the tin box of seeds beside it, and hung her cloak on the peg behind the door, with the iron key still in its pocket, where she could hear the faint dull clunk of it settle against the wood. Thomas stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands, and began several times to say something, and each time thought better of it. She turned and told him gently that she would like a little while to herself before supper. He kissed her forehead and went away down the stair. She did not weep. She sat a few minutes on the edge of the narrow bed with her hands folded in her lap, and let the shape of the afternoon settle into her, the way one lets bread dough rest before working it. Then she got up, took off her bonnet, tied on one of her aprons, unpacked her 3 wool dresses and hung them on the pegs, laid her Bible and her needle case in the top drawer of the chest, and set Mrs. Hollisher's brass trowel on the windowsill in a bar of thin northern light, so that the initials M.H. burned into the handle showed faintly against the wood. Then she stood at the window a long moment, looking down through the kitchen yard and the arch in the yew hedge beyond it, past the ranks of neglected cabbages and the broken cold frames, to where at the far end of the walled garden the iron ribs of the greenhouse rose out of the ivy, like the ribcage of some great gray animal that had lain down there and never got up again. The panes she could see from this distance were black with lichen where they were not broken. A young ash tree had rooted itself against the west wall and was reaching in through a gap in the glass. She looked at it for a full quarter of an hour, quite still, the way she had once looked at a difficult page of Loudon's when she was 14 and could not yet read half the words in it. Then she turned from the window, smoothed her apron, and went down to help the cook lay the servants' supper, because she did not yet know what else to do with her hands, and because she had never in her life sat idle in a strange house. The next morning she rose before the household, drew a shawl about her shoulders against the April cold, took the great iron key from the pocket of her cloak, and went down through the kitchen yard alone. The gravel path through the walled garden was choked with couch grass and dead nettle. The espaliered pears along the south wall had gone unpruned so long that they were more thicket than tree, and a robin sang somewhere out of sight with the small clear insistence of a bird that has had the place to itself for years. Mist hung in the low corners. The dew soaked through the toes of her ankle boots before she had gone 20 paces. She walked steadily, the trowel in her apron pocket knocking softly against her hip at every step, the iron key cold in her closed hand, until she stood at last before the rusted door of the greenhouse and lifted her face to look up through the ivy at the broken panes above her, and prepared, very quietly and quite alone, to turn a lock that had not been turned in 11 years. The key went in stiffly and turned only after Sarah worked it back and forth 3 times with both hands, easing the rust inside the wards. The lock gave with a low grating sound like something waking under water. The door itself would not swing on its hinges. She had to set her shoulder to it and push, and even then it moved in slow, reluctant inches, dragging a fan shape through the leaf litter and moss on the tiles inside. She stepped through the gap she had made and stood a moment on the threshold, breathing the air. It smelt of wet iron, old earth, and something faintly sweet beneath, like the ghost of jasmine long dead. The greenhouse was longer than she had guessed from the window, perhaps 30 feet by 15, with an arched iron ridge running the length of the roof and cast iron ribs curving down to a low brick footing painted once with lime wash and now streaked green. The floor was of red quarry tiles set in a herringbone pattern, cracked in places where roots had lifted them, and down the center ran a raised staging of slate slabs on brick piers. On either side, along the walls, were the beds, deep planting beds edged in more brick, the soil in them black and matted with the fibrous roots of things long since gone to seed and died. Half the panes overhead were broken. Ivy had come in through the gaps and hung down in long ropes, and in one corner the ash sapling had pushed a slender, pale trunk through a shattered light and was reaching for the ridge. Where the glass was whole, it was leaded in small diamond quarrels. Several of the lead cames had failed and let the diamonds slip, but the ironwork itself was sound where Sarah rapped her knuckles on it, only pitted with rust, not eaten through. At the far end stood a small potting bench of scrubbed deal turned gray with damp, and beside it a stove of black iron, no bigger than a milk churn, with a flue that ran up the back wall and out through the roof. There were terracotta pots stacked in leaning towers, a watering can with its rose-choked green, a pair of secateurs on the bench with the blades seized shut, and, on a shelf above, a row of glass jars labeled in a woman's small clear hand: lavender, rue, feverfew, barrage, sweet Sicily, the labels foxed but legible. Sarah walked the length of the house slowly, touching nothing at first. She noted the broken panes and counted them. 41 gone, she thought, out of perhaps 300. She noted the fallen slates on the north side of the ridge where rain had come in worst. She noted that the beds nearest the stove had drained best, and that the soil there, though tangled, looked deep and workable. She noted a wooden trug on the floor beside the bench, tipped over, with something dark inside it that might once have been a pair of gardening gloves. She noted a woman's straw sun hat hanging on a nail by the door, its ribbon bleached colorless, its crown broken in, and she stopped when she saw it, and stood for a while with her hand on the door frame. She did not touch the hat. She walked onto the potting bench and set both her palms flat on its surface, and looked down the length of the greenhouse in the pale April light coming greenly through the ivy, and she thought, without any drama, that the place could be brought back. That was her first clear thought. She thought that the ironwork was sound, and the beds were deep, and the stove was whole, and that with time and slates and glass and patience she could bring it back. Then she went out, drew the door to behind her as far as it would go, and returned to the house for her breakfast. She came back after breakfast with a broom, a bucket, a pair of old leather gloves borrowed from the boot boy, and Mrs. Hollisher's trowel in her apron pocket. She began at the door end and worked inward. She swept the tiles clear of leaf mold and mouse droppings and the fine gray grit of 11 winters' fallen plaster. She lifted the fallen ivy ropes down out of the roof by hand and coiled them and carried them out to the yard. She righted the tipped trug and found beneath it, indeed, a pair of gardener's gloves, the leather gone hard as bark, and set them aside. She cleared the slate staging. She scraped moss from the brick edging of the beds with the back of the trowel. She did not hurry. She worked as Mrs. Hollisher had taught her, in one direction, finishing each patch before moving to the next. It was on the third morning, when she began to clear the deepest bed along the north wall, that the trowel struck something that was not stone and not root. She was kneeling on a folded sack, digging out the woody crown of a dead rosemary that must once have been a great bush and was now only a knot of gray timber, and the trowel, going down beside the crown, met a flat resistance and rang faintly, iron on iron. She stopped. She cleared the soil away carefully with her fingers, brushing black earth from the shape below, and there emerged the corner of a small metal box, buried perhaps 10 inches down, close against the brick footing of the wall. She dug around it and lifted it out. It was a japanned tin box, perhaps 12 inches by 8, painted black once and now scabbed with rust and earth, with a simple hasp and no lock, only a bit of copper wire twisted through the staple to hold it shut. She carried it to the potting bench, wiped it clean with the corner of her apron, untwisted the wire, and opened it. Inside, wrapped in oiled silk that had held well, were 3 things. A small chamois bag, heavy for its size, which when she loosened its drawstring poured into her palm a soft yellow weight of sovereigns. She counted them there on the bench, one by one, and made 42. A folded packet of banknotes, Bank of England 5s and 10s, dry and only a little foxed at the edges, which she counted and made 60 pounds. And beneath these, folded flat, a letter of several sheets in a woman's small clear hand. The same hand, Sarah saw at once, that had labeled the jars of lavender and rue on the shelf above. She sat down on the upturned bucket. She wiped her hands very carefully on her apron. She unfolded the letter and read, "To whoever finds this, whether by chance or by kindness, my name is Margaret Weaver, and I've been the mistress of Ashcombe Hall these 17 years. I am 41 years old as I write. I was a doctor's daughter from Ludlow before my marriage, and I have kept this greenhouse with my own hands since the second year I came here, because it was the one place in the house that was mine." Sarah read on in the greenish light, the sovereigns cold in her lap and the banknotes on the bench beside her, and did not, for a long while, move. The letter went on in that same small, clear hand for 4 close-written sheets. Margaret Weaver had written that she had come to Ashcombe at 24, that she had brought her own small inheritance from her father the Ludlow doctor, and that this inheritance had never been placed in her husband's name because her father, a careful man, had tied it up in trust and paid her the income in coin twice a year. She had saved what she could of that income in the tin box behind the rosemary. She wrote that her husband was not a violent man, but a cold one, that her elder son Edmund had grown into his father's coldness before he was 15, and that her younger son Thomas was gentle and might yet be saved from the house if any woman loved him well enough to take him from it. She wrote that she was tired in a way sleep did not mend, that her chest had been troubling her since Christmas, and that she meant to walk into the greenhouse one morning and lie down among her lavenders, and let whatever came, come. She asked that whoever found the box should not think ill of her, and should use the money for something living. She signed her name, Margaret Weaver, and beneath it the date, the 9th of September, 1842. Sarah folded the sheets along their old creases, put them back into the tin, put the sovereigns and notes back into the tin, closed the hasp, and set the box beneath the potting bench with a slate over it. She sat a long while more. Then she rose, took up her broom again, and finished the north bed before she went in for dinner. She told Thomas nothing that day, nor the next. She told him on the third evening, in their small room over the still room, with the door shut and the candle low, and she read him the letter and put the tin into his hands. Thomas wept without sound for a long time. Then he said his mother had loved Lavender above all things, and that he had not been allowed to speak of her in the house since he was 10 years old. Sarah said they would speak of her now, and that they would begin with the glass. In the village of Ashcombe, 3 miles down the lane, Sarah found a glazier named Mr. Pethick, aged 58, who had leaded church windows for 30 years, and who came up to the hall on a Tuesday morning with a leather roll of tools. A coil of lead came, and a boy to carry his ladder. He climbed the iron ribs with the ease of a man half his age, measured every broken quarrel, and quoted her £4 12 shillings for glass and lead and labor together. Sarah paid him from Margaret's notes without asking her father-in-law, and Mr. Pethick, when he understood whose greenhouse it was, took off his cap once inside the door and put it on again without comment. A slater called Mr. Bawden, aged 40, came the following week and replaced 11 slates on the north pitch of the ridge for £1.6. A carpenter named Mr. Hook, aged 62, and lame in one leg from a fall off a barn 20 years before, planned a new sill for the door and fitted a fresh iron hinge above the old one so the door swung true. The blacksmith's boy, aged 14, whose name was Ned Trewin, came up with a can of linseed oil and rubbed down every rusted rib of the ironwork over 3 long afternoons, and Sarah paid him 6 pence a day and gave him bread and cheese and small beer at the potting bench. Sarah cleared the beds herself, one at a time, in the order Mrs. Hollisher would have chosen. She dug out the dead rosemary and the woody crown of an old sage and the black remains of what had been a bay tree in a broken pot. She sieved the soil through a garden riddle borrowed from the head gardener's shed, mixed it with well-rotted manure from the stable heap, and turned it back into the beds a spade at a time. She opened her tin of grandmother's seeds on the potting bench the last week of April, and she sowed sweet pea against the west wall and marigold in a strip along the central staging, and she pricked out poppy seedlings into little clay pots she had scrubbed one by one in a bucket in the kitchen yard. She lit the small black stove one cold evening with kindling and a shovel of coal from the house cellar, and she watched the iron warm and the frost bloom clear from the inside of the new leaded panes. The cook at the hall was a woman called Mrs. Denby, aged 53, who had known Margaret Weaver and had not spoken of her in 11 years. Mrs. Denby began, without saying why, to send a covered plate out to the greenhouse at midday. A slice of pie, a boiled egg, a heel of bread with cheese, and to collect the plate empty in the afternoon. The housekeeper, Mrs. Otway, aged 60 and stiff of back, came down one wet morning with an armful of clean sacking for Sarah to kneel on, set it on the bench without a word, and went away again. The head gardener, Mr. Rundle, aged 67, who had been kept on for the front lawns and the drive, and who had not set foot in the walled garden since the September Margaret disappeared, came through the yew-arch one Thursday, stood at the greenhouse door, and asked Sarah if she should like the espaliered pears pruned back this year or next. Sarah said this year, and thank you. Mr. Rundle nodded once and went to fetch his long-handled saw. By the end of May, the greenhouse was watertight. By the middle of June, the sweet peas were climbing hazel sticks Ned Trewin had cut and bundled from the hedgerow, and the marigolds were showing their first orange along the staging, and the poppies had gone out into the south bed and were shaking their gray leaves in the draught from the propped-open door. Sarah had begun a still-room shelf of her own along the west wall, with new labels in her own hand beneath Margaret's older ones, and she was drying comfrey and meadowsweet in bunches hung from a nail above the stove. The vicar of the parish, a Mr. Amberley aged 48, walked up one afternoon on parish business and stayed an hour talking of medicinal herbs and left with a small twist of dried feverfew in his coat pocket for his wife's headaches. People in the village began to know Sarah's name before they had properly met her. The blacksmith's wife sent up a jar of honey with Ned. The wheelwright's daughter, aged 19 and called Alice Pethick, the glazier's niece, came up shy one Saturday with a slip of white jasmine wrapped in wet moss because she had heard the young Mrs. Weaver at the hall was making the old greenhouse live again, and her aunt had said Mrs. Margaret used to keep a jasmine there. Sarah planted the slip against the south wall beside the door and watered it with rain from the butt. Within the hall, the arrangement of the household shifted by small degrees and without any announcement. Mr. Weaver the elder did not speak to Sarah of the greenhouse, but he ceased to speak of her as though she were not in the room. Mr. Edmund kept to the library and the stables and his own contempt, but his contempt no longer carried in the house because no one took it up. Mrs. Weaver, the second wife, came down one morning to the walled garden in a gray shawl, stood inside the greenhouse door for perhaps 2 minutes, looking at the leaded panes and the marigolds, and left without a word. But at supper that evening she passed Sarah the salt without being asked, and asked her, quite civilly, whether the sweet peas were doing. Thomas began to come out to the greenhouse in the evenings after supper. He would sit on the upturned bucket while Sarah worked, and he would talk about his mother in small, careful pieces, a song she had sung, a name she had called the tabby cat, the way she had laughed at his father once at a dinner and been sent from the table. He had not spoken these things aloud in 11 years, and Sarah listened while she pricked out seedlings and did not press him and did not stop him. By July he was pruning the espaliered pears alongside Mr. Rundle on Saturday afternoons in his shirt sleeves, and by August he had learned to tie a raspberry cane. The greenhouse acquired, without anyone naming it so, a small settled routine. At 7 in the morning, Sarah opened the door and the roof vent Mr. Hook had rehung on its iron rod. At 9, she took the covered plate from Mrs. Denby at the yew-arch. At noon, she watered from the butt with the mended can. At 4, Ned came up from the forge for an hour to sweep, oil, carry, and eat his bread. At 6, Thomas came out. On Sundays, the door stayed shut, and Sarah went to church at Ashcombe with her husband and sat 3 pews behind the elder Mr. Weaver, and Mr. Amberley began nodding to her from the pulpit before the first hymn. On a still evening in early September, when the light through the leaded panes had turned the color of weak honey and the swallows were beginning to gather on the ridge of the stable roof, Sarah sat on the upturned bucket inside the greenhouse, with the door propped open and the small black stove cold beside her. The sweet peas were past their best along the west wall and had begun to set their papery pods. The marigolds were bright and rough and full of bees. The jasmine slip from Alice Pethick had put out 4 new leaves against the south wall and taken hold. On the potting bench, on a folded square of clean linen, Sarah had laid out two things side by side. One was Mrs. Hollisher's brass trowel with the nick in its blade and the initials M.H. burned faintly into the wooden handle. The other was the japanned tin box, wiped clean now and rubbed with a little linseed oil against the rust, holding Margaret Weaver's letter folded along its old creases and a single sprig of dried lavender laid on top. Sarah looked from one to the other for a long while. Two women she had never met in life had shaped the room she sat in. One had taught her to work in one direction and finish each patch before moving to the next, and had put a trowel into her hand a week before dying in a small room above a scullery. The other had knelt in these same beds 17 years, had labeled the jars on the shelf above the bench in a small, clear hand, and had left a tin box behind a rosemary bush for someone she would never see. Neither had lived to see what her hands had begun. Both had loved someone they had not been permitted to keep. Sarah thought of the drawing room on the afternoon of her arrival, and the great iron key on its wooden tray, and Mr. Edmund's small sound by the window that might have been a laugh. She thought of her father-in-law's steady voice settling on her the one part of the estate that no one else in the house would enter. She understood now that they had meant it as a burden and a warning, and that the house had told itself for 11 years a quiet story in which Margaret Weaver had walked out through the iron door and simply vanished, and that the story had been easier for them than the letter in the tin. She was not angry. Anger, Mrs. Hollisher had once said while stirring a pan of rendered lard, was a fire that used its own fuel and left nothing for the bread. Sarah had bread to make. She took up the trowel and put it in the pocket of her apron. She closed the tin and set it on the shelf between the jar of feverfew and the jar of barrage, where Margaret's hand and hers now labeled side by side. She stepped out into the walled garden and pulled the door to behind her, not locked, only closed. The great iron key hung now on a nail above the potting bench and was turned only against frost. Sarah Weaver was 21 and had come to Ashcombe Hall with a small trunk, a carpet-bag, a tin of her grandmother's seeds, a book wrapped in oilcloth, a brass trowel in a pocket sewn against her hip, and a husband who loved her without knowing how to defend her. They had given her the greenhouse no one would enter, and the key to a lock that had not been turned in 11 years. It was the best portion she was ever given. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to subscribe and share it with someone who understands what it means to be handed the thing no one else wanted. And before you go, tell me this. What place in your own life did others call worthless that turned out, in your hands, to be the one thing worth keeping?